I feel I carried 2015 on my back. I feel like the reason there's a 4.2 billion price tag on the company is because of me. I believe that's what the Chinese estimate my net worth at 4.2 billion. So I feel I deserved a little bit of leeway.
When Conor suggested that the UFC's $4 billion price tag was what the Chinese estimated as his net worth, he may have been a little closer to the truth than we initially imagined. MMA Junkie just released details of the UFC's financial figures for 2015, and the article placed huge emphasis on McGregor. Now, there's been a lot of debate online about whether or not Conor is getting too much credit for the quoted pay-per-view numbers, but before I discuss that, let me quickly run through the figures, because there's one conclusion that is absolutely fucking staggering. So the UFC's total revenue for 2015 was a record $609 million. The single biggest contributor to revenue is obviously still their pay-per-view sales, which accounts for almost 40% of total revenue. With over 2 million buys, Conor McGregor events were responsible for a whopping 25% of pay-per-view sales. Now the article places all the emphasis on McGregor, but Ronda actually sold more. She sold 2.6 million pay-per-views. The difference is, Conor only fought 2 fucking times last year, which is crazy. In just 2 events, he accounted for a quarter of the UFC's pay-per-view sales. But we already knew McGregor is the main man in terms of pay-per-views. What's really shocking is that Conor has had 2 of the 3 biggest pay-per-views in MMA history this year. His 2 fights with Nate generated almost 3.3 million pay-per-views. Now, UFC 205 is easily the most stacked card the UFC have ever put on, and it's their debut event in New York. Looking at the undercard and the way Conor's numbers have skyrocketed, it's reasonable to speculate that UFC 205 will break 2 million pay-per-views. Add in the fact that the UFC's only other megastar, Ronda Rousey, will only fight once this year, and the conclusion is fucking shocking. Conor McGregor events will probably account for over 50% of pay-per-view buys this year, more than fucking half. That is insanity. So when people bitch and moan about the special treatment, there's your fucking answer. This ain't Cuba where everybody gets an equally shit deal. This ain't the college safe space where reality takes a backseat to people's fucking feelings. This is business, and by far the biggest business in town right now is Conor McFucking-Gregor. Love him or hate him, 50% of pay-per-views is a fucking boatload of negotiating power and a shit ton of special treatment. One of the biggest criticisms of the article is that Conor is getting too much credit for those numbers because all of Conor's events have had huge co-main events. Now, there was something to that argument initially. Conor's first pay-per-view headline came against Chad Mendes at UFC 189. The co-main event was an amazing Robbie Lawler-Rory MacDonald welterweight title fight. This event sold just over 800,000 pay-per-views, which was great for a first pay-per-view and against a late replacement. But the very next event, Ronda Rousey defended her belt against a fighter who wouldn't have even qualified for the Special Olympics in an event with a dog shit main card, and she still outsold McGregor by 100,000 buys. McGregor haters were almost banging in the streets when these figures were released because they regarded Conor as somewhat of a pay-per-view flop. Their celebrations were somewhat short-lived though, because in his next fight against Jose Aldo he did considerably better, selling in the region of 1.2 million pay-per-views. But UFC 194 was one of the most stacked cards of last year. Rockhold Weidman, Romero Jacare, Maya Gunner, Holloway Stevens. I mean, Chris Weidman had already been involved in several huge cards. The Anderson rematch sold over 1 million buys, so it was difficult to gauge just how much credit McGregor deserved for those events and how much was simply down to an absolutely stacked card. For those events, it's probably a combination of the two. The UFC likely saw what way the wind was blowing with all the McGregor buzz, realized they had a potential megastar on their hands, but because his mainstream exposure was limited and as a fledgling pay-per-view star, they understood it was necessary to give him the biggest promotional push they could by crossing their fingers and stacking the absolute fuck out of his first few events. Clever strategy, and it paid off big time, because as I mentioned, McGregor's last 2 events are in the top 3 biggest MMA pay-per-views ever. He did have solid undercards, but by breaking 1.6 million buys on both, there's absolutely no doubt that those cards would not have done anywhere near those numbers with any other available main event. So yes, initially Conor seemed to benefit from massive undercards, but when you consider 2016's figures, there's just no arguing with the overall gist of the piece, that Conor McGregor, and not Ronda Rousey as Dana likes to claim, is by far the UFC's biggest ever star. After 205, Conor will have headlined 3 of the 4 biggest cards ever, and he will have done it in 1 fucking year. Inside 12 months. That is just insanity. One thing people have been kind of using to maybe diminish those figures a little is that it takes 2 to fight. You know, Aldo deserves a lot of credit. Nate Diaz deserves a lot of credit. Look, Nate definitely deserves credit, especially in the rematch, which was entirely marketed on the rivalry developed in the first fight when he dropped his bong, rolled off the couch, and choked the fuck out of Conor on short notice. So yeah, of course, give the guy his due respect. He's earned it. But let's not pretend this was a Manny Pacquiao-Floyd Mayweather type scenario. I mean, Conor has to fight someone, and whoever it is, it's gonna be a huge event. He can't fucking fight himself. If he could, it would be the biggest pay-per-view ever, because he is the one common factor in all these record-breaking events. I mean, the guy makes Dana White's job as a promoter easy. The guy promotes himself. All you gotta do is switch on the camera, and it's a million fucking hits on YouTube. So yeah, obviously, Nate absolutely deserves huge respect. He was essential in building the story for the rematch, but in terms of the overall hype, the media frenzy, and the revenue the 2 fights generated, let's not act like he wasn't caught up in an already surging MMA phenomenon. One last thing I want to mention is that we're lucky the biggest star in our sport is a guy who has not had a boring fucking second in the octagon and actually wants to jump up weight and fight the best. We take that for granted, but unfortunately, being exciting doesn't always mean you're a big draw, and being the biggest star doesn't always mean you're an exciting fighter. When Pride folded in 2007 and people were polarized on Fedor, I almost felt sorry for his haters because they were so busy trying to pick holes in his resume or discredit his wins that they almost missed the tail end of one of the greatest and most exciting sprees of pure fucking savagery the sport will ever see. I don't see Conor McGregor being one of these guys still fighting at 40 years of age, getting in sloppy brawls, taking huge shots and slurring his speech. He's making too much money and he seems too smart for that fucking nonsense. So we may already be past the midpoint of this guy's UFC career. Now if you hate the guy, you don't like the special treatment, or you think he's arrogant or disrespectful, at least try to enjoy the fucking ride.